HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Talking Back, Talking Black, Truths About America's Lingua Franca by John Mcwhorter, read by John Mcwhorter. For Vanessa Hamilton Mcwhorter, who came into this world born reflective while I was writing this book, I hope that she'll read this as soon as she's old enough to take it in, to make sure she never for a second thinks black people's speech is full of mistakes. And for my cousin Octavia Thompson, who speaks what I think of as the perfect black English, which I dare anybody to diss. Introduction. In Haiti, the language of print, school, and the media is French. But when speaking outside of formal settings, people use another form of speech, Haitian Creole. In Sicily, the language of print, school, and the media is Standard Italian. But when speaking outside of formal settings, many people use another form of speech, Sicilian. In Switzerland, the language of print, school, and the media is High German, but for German speakers in that country, outside of formal settings, they use something other than High German, Swiss German, which is quite different in sound, vocabulary, and structure from the German one learns from a book. In the United States, the language of print, school, and the media is Standard English, but when speaking outside of formal settings, Black American people use a lot of slang and bad grammar. At least that is the general American take on the matter. However, comparing the situation here with that in other nations, it becomes clear that we may be missing something. Why would it be that in so many places, casual language is an alternative to the standard one, treated as perfectly normal, while here in the United States, the casual speech of millions of people is thought of as a degradation of the standard form, rather than simply something different? Certainly, racism is part of the answer. However, Black Americans themselves lack the clear conception of their speech as an alternate form of language that Haitians, Jamaicans, and Swiss Germans have. They, as well as whites, tend to be perplexed at the notion of themselves as speaking Black English in the way that a Haitian speaks something in addition to French, or Germanophone Swiss speaks something in addition to High German. To America as a whole, Black English is rather like ultraviolet light. Scientists, linguists in this case, discuss it, but for almost everybody else, it's an unperceived abstraction despite permeating our very existences. The result is dissonances such as one that I experienced 20 years ago. I had the unexpected experience of being taken up for 15 minutes of modest media notoriety. Suddenly, America's television shows and newspapers wanted to know what I thought about, of all things, Black English. The matter was actually more specific. Oakland, California School Board had proposed using Black English as an aid to imparting Standard English to Black kids. The idea was to address Black students' lagging scholastic performance with the hypothesis that part of the reason for it was that the English they encountered on the page was different from the English they spoke as a home language. I happened to be the Black linguist, or maybe the linguist who studied Black speech varieties closest by, since I then was teaching at UC Berkeley. From our vantage point today, it seems almost odd that there was a weeks-long media firestorm over whether a smallish city would be using Black English as a teaching tool. Similar proposals that had popped up in other cities over the 25 years before are today recalled only by those involved. It was partly that Oakland made its announcement during a slow news cycle before Christmas, and partly that this was at the dawn of the 24-hour cable internet news era. If it had happened just a couple of years before, the whole affair would barely have registered beyond California. However, the issue also resonated to such a degree because it entailed a judgment not only about Black language, but about Black people. The Oakland School Board was roundly disparaged as opportunistic, chasing bilingual education funds, with a crackpot proposal that Black English is an African language. Jokes about Ebonics in the wake of the fracas circulate online to this day. Ebonics dictionary entry, penis. I went to the doctor and he handed me a cup and said penis, pee in this. Many wondered why black people were supposed to be exempt from leaving the speech of the ghetto behind the way other immigrant groups have done, and saw the whole Oakland proposal as a kind of unreasoning identity politics. For most linguists and educators involved in this saga, or observing it, the racist element in all this vitriol and japery was what they carried away. The assumption was, therefore, that the academics' responsibility in commentary on the issue was to focus on calling attention to the role of racism in how people feel about Black English. That assumption was considered so unassailable that I actually found myself deemed un-PC on the issue by other linguists and educators specializing in Black English for arguing that the reason Black kids have trouble in school is not Black English, but the quality of the schools themselves, as well as the problems that life in disadvantaged communities can saddle students with. Yes, indeed, that was considered a disloyal position for a linguist to take. There was, in fact, something beyond societal inequality that motivated my position, however. Racism is hardly the only thing standing between how linguists see Black English and how the public sees it. What most struck me in 1996, and what I carried away from the whole business, was that America, Black as well as white, had no idea that there was even a Black English worthy of discussion. Linguists talked of grammar. The public talked of slang and mistakes. This never changed. But crucially, even acknowledging racism as an element in the debate, no one could deny that if the dust-up had been about teaching white redneck in the schools in Mississippi, there would have been very similar anger and ridicule. Racially or not, linguists and the general public see speech very differently. Americans have trouble comprehending that any vernacular way of speaking is legitimate language. Given this situation, during the Oakland controversy, linguists seemed unhinged. Is Ebonics a language? People would ask, with the quietly acrid skepticism with which one would ask whether Elmo is a philosopher. Television commentator Tucker Carlson derided Ebonics as a language where nobody knows how to conjugate the verbs, as if it's unquestioned that Standard English's verb conjugations are logically inseparable from any English conceivable as coherent. And the Oakland episode was just one step on a timeline. It's now been almost 50 years since linguistic experts began studying Black English as a legitimate speech variety, arguing that Black Americans' colloquial English is not a degradation of English, but one of many variations upon English. This effort has been largely in vain. Even now, I feel moved to specify, to some degree, what I mean by Black English, given that so many factors cloud our vision as to just what the term might refer. There are two main ways that various dialects of a language differ: the sound, or accent, and the sentence structure. For example, for an American, British people's English is different in its accent, that pot sounds more like pot, etc. The main task that faces an American actor playing the part of a British character is to change the way he articulates the sounds of the words. Black English, in the same way, has some sounds that are different from those in Standard English. It's these different sounds that give Americans the impression that someone can sound black, an intuition often harbored with a certain ambivalence, but based on a genuine difference in accent that linguistic research has confirmed the existence of. British English also has some sentence structures different from those in American English. In the United States, one says, "If she had smelled it, then I would have." Whereas in England, one might more likely say, "If she had smelt it, then I would have done." The past tense of smelled is formed differently, and in British English, the do verb is often used differently than in American English. Black English, in this same way, has some sentence structures different from those in Standard English. For example, "if she had smelled it" might in Black English be "if she had done smelt it." Here's an example of perfect Black English in which we can see how sentence structures differ from those in Standard English. It a girl named Shirley Jones live in Washington. Most everybody on the street like her, 'cause she a nice girl. Shirley treat all of them just like they was her sister and brother, But most of all, she liked one boy named Charles. But Shirley keep away from Charles most of the time, 'cause she start to liking him. So much she be scared of him. So Charles, he don't hardly say nothing to her neither. Still, that girl got to go round telling everybody Charles supposed to be liking her. But when Valentine Day start to come round, Shirley get to worrying. She worried 'cause she know the rest of them girls going to get Valentine cards from their boyfriends. Some basic features of Black English structure are in that passage. It is used instead of the presentational there. Live instead of lives. The third person singular s is not necessary. She-a. The linking verb be can often be omitted. She be scared. However, this usage of be signals that something goes on over a long period of time, such as Shirley's fright. Or, he don't hardly say nothing to her neither. Double negatives don't make a positive in Black English. Or, she know the rest of them girls. Them often replaces those. Notice that there's no slang in this passage. Slang is one part of Black English, but then slang is also rife in anyone's English, and there's much more to Black English than argot. Slang comes and goes. The Black English I refer to is more long-lived. This dialect is centuries old. Yet despite people laying out data about Black English for decades, the perception of the dialect has remained largely unchanged since the first articles on what was then termed Negro English in now yellowing issues of academic journals in the 1960s. A small community of scholars study Black English intensely, discoursing enthusiastically about African American vernacular English, or AV, code switching, and identity, it being second nature to them to analyze the speech of Black Americans with the same tools other linguists use to study Hungarian and Japanese. Since the 1970s, these scholars have transferred this conception to educators with a certain amount of success. However, even among them, one still encounters teachers attesting that Black English is okay, but still harboring a sense of it as a passel of mistakes. Only okay, then, in the sense that it's okay to belch openly at home. And beyond this, other than to occasional self-taught aficionados, Black English specialists' sense of Black English seems counterintuitive and possibly kooky, like the idea of multiverses or chi. The impression remains that Black English is simply a collection of streety expressions rather than also a system of grammar and an accent requiring native mastery to control fully. I experienced one manifestation of this in the classroom. Once, a regular result of teaching a class about Black English as having a grammar was that Black students would notice that they spoke this language you were putting on the board. These days, not uncommonly, I'm noting white students similarly excited that they speak Black English. These people are the first generation raised entirely within the era of hip-hop as mainstream music, and there are, indeed, some white people who truly control the structures of the dialect and would sound Black on an audio recording. Most of the time, however, what young white Americans thinking of themselves as Black English speakers are referring to is not the grammatical apparatus that linguists study, but Black slang expressions. That is, they, too, have had no way of knowing that Black English is anything but slang. How, in current American discourse, could they have learned the rest of the story? Meanwhile, something else that encourages ignorance of Black English's existence is, ironically, a desire not to stereotype. Namely, one is often taught that the only reason we might think there's a Black way to talk is that we're essentializing Black people, and that actually Black people simply speak Southern English. Back in 1971, civil rights leader Bayard Rustin argued that Black English, after all, has nothing to do with Blackness but derives from conditions of lower-class life in the South. Poor Southern whites also speak Black English. Rustin's perspective lives on today. Yet while there's an obvious overlap between Black and Southern English, few would say that Jeff Foxworthy and Samuel L. Jackson speak the same dialect. The differences are significant, documented by linguists, and immediately apparent to an American ear. When someone says, he the one, instead of he's the one, uses ain't for didn't, as in he ain't told me, or uses be in that ongoing sense that Shirley did, they're speaking Black, not Southern English. No one goes about consciously aware of such things, but they're part of the sense we have that there's indeed a Black way of talking. Yet there have been remarks that Hillary Clinton adopts a Southern accent when talking to Black audiences. But does anyone think Black people in Pittsburgh would really feel a special connection to the speech style of Dolly Parton or Jim Nabors? People are using Southern as a stand-in for Black out of a wariness of being criticized. What do you mean talking like a Black person? Someone might say. And crucially, that wariness is entirely justified. In after-talk question sessions, online chat forums, and even general conversation, speculation persists that Black English is really just Southern dialect. In yet another way, then, people miss a key component in America's speech repertoire. Since 1996, the media has further sought my opinions about Black English now and then, and each time I confront the very same conception of the dialect that reigned in the middle of the Clinton administration and before, that Black English is simply a flippant lingo. As recently as 2013, media commentators were baffled by the ordinary Black English used on the witness stand by Rachel Jeantel during the trial of the killer of her friend, teenager Trayvon Martin. Jeantel was simply using the grammatical patterns of Black English used all over the United States, and yet intelligent people actually consulted with me as to whether she was more comfortable in her parents' Haitian Creole than in English. Before that, in 2010, the media had reported that the Drug Enforcement Administration had called for translators to help understand what surreptitiously recorded Black criminals were saying. Black English, with its different accent from Standard English and different ways of putting sentences together, proved hard for non-speakers to understand on a recording made under less than ideal conditions, where people were speaking rapidly, their voices often overlapping one another, as typically occurs in actual conversation. In Italy, no one would bat an eye if translators were called in to make sense of recordings made under equivalent conditions of Sicilian or Milanese. Here in the United States, however, that Black English could require such treatment seemed absurd to many, baffled at the idea that Black English is anything but lingo and grammatical mistakes. Seen only in part, looked past, or mistaken as something else, Black English in the American mind remains a phantom. It doesn't have to be this way, and the goal of this book is enlightenment. Linguists, including me, are responsible for the fact that almost nobody knows that there exists something called Black English, which is complex enough to require books and academic articles to analyze, and which has its own grammatical structure, just as Standard English does, or Finnish, or Japanese. Certainly, plenty of books have been written outlining and celebrating Black English, demonstrating that it's systematic in its structure and also the vehicle of a rich culture. However, the sad and simple fact is that a dialect can be seen as both systematic and culturally rich, while processed as bad grammar, nevertheless. I see four main barriers to understanding. 1. When the public encounters the assertion that Black English is more than gutter talk, the argument usually depicts Black English as largely a matter of discarding or distorting standard language forms. 2. Partly because of that perception, many Americans worry that even to acknowledge that there's a Black way of talking may be racist. 3. The relatively uniform linguistic landscape of Anglophone America encourages a sense that people can't speak both a standard and a non-standard form of a language in a complementary relationship. 4. Many equate Black English with the distorted dialect that minstrel show performers used, and supposed that the cartoonish quality of the latter requires treating the former as equally dismissible. I'm aware that some feel that racism is the reason people disparage Black English, and that issues like the ones I've just mentioned may be considered worth talking about, but that they essentially skirt the point. However, I'd request those who feel that way to bear with me. Racism, after all, isn't going away anytime soon, but in my experience, people can be made to see Black English in a new way regardless. I present approaches here that I have found effective in imparting to reasonable skeptics, unconverted but open-minded, that is, the typical rational person, that Black English is not bad grammar, but alternate grammar. The book is very directly targeted. I intend these chapters as didactic and sometimes exploratory essays. One may come away from them with a sense of having been introduced to the dialect, but for formal and comprehensive introduction to the structures and usage of Black English, the listener must seek other teachers, such as Geneva Smitherman, William Labov, John Rickford, and Lisa Green. This book is intended as building on the groundwork such scholars have established. A note on terminology. To some, the term Black English may have a musty air. Specialists have long moved on to African American vernacular English, while among laymen, the term Ebonics gained a foothold in the wake of the Oakland controversy, which revived it, although it had otherwise fallen out of usage after a brief vogue in the 1970s. I am eschewing African American vernacular English partly because in this book I'm addressing not only vernacular speech, but also standard speech. Black Americans can sound identifiably Black even when using neither slang nor grammatical features of the dialect. African American English could be a possible substitute, but along with African American vernacular English, it runs up against the fact that the dialect has very little identifiable African influence in it. Also, since the 1990s, the number of immigrants from Africa in the United States has grown so much that the very term African American is becoming increasingly confusing. White South African immigrants are genuinely perplexed that they don't qualify as African Americans, for example. Meanwhile, the term Ebonics, although I've given into it somewhat over the years, is unfortunate. Its reference to dark skin makes it much too general to apply only to Black people in the United States. In fact, it was originally coined to refer to all languages of the African diaspora. Then also the ix suffix is modeled on the word phonics out of a sense that phonics involves language. However, the ix suffix is not properly applied to the name of a language or dialect, as opposed to, say, a reading program. For our purposes, then, Black English it will be. I have always thought the term does the job quite well. The concept here is more important than the label. It's time the dialect was discussed as something both interesting and normal. America hasn't known how to do that. This book attempts to show the way. Chapter 1. It's complicated. A toy piano isn't a Steinway, right? The real story about Black English grammar. I'll never forget the time a woman from Japan, who had been in the United States for a long time and spoke very good English, casually said to me that I was different from other Black Americans in that you don't use bad grammar. Her being from another country and culture made her comfortable spelling that out to me so bluntly, but her judgment as to how Black Americans talk was, let's face it, representative of how most Americans feel, including quite a few Black ones. For example, James Meredith, who was the first Black person admitted to the University of Mississippi, has later in his life handed out a flyer before talks to young Black audiences that includes this advice: Black English language, proper English language. Which one do you use? Most people in this room use a lot of Black English and a little proper English. anyone who wants to become an intellectual giant must learn and use a lot of proper English and as little Black English as possible. I am not going to argue with anyone about the matter. You can do what you want to do. However, I will tell you that anyone who continues to use a lot of Black English will never become an intellectual giant. To me, Black English is like a clockwork or an engine, a system every bit as coherent as Latin or Chinese. But to most Americans, Black English means error. Typically, it's thought that the reason the public fails to understand that Black English is coherent speech is racism. A typical reaction to this failure is, no matter what we say, they just don't get it. Of course, it's because they don't want to get it. And surely racism plays a part in how Black English is heard. However, here's a thought. If it happened to be white people from a remote part of the country who spoke exactly the way Black people can, do we really think people would in that case just accept their speech as okay? We barely have to wonder because the speech of uneducated Southern whites comes under a lot of fire as well. The speech of Appalachian whites is condemned to an even greater degree. There are ample testimonials in that community to linguistic self-consciousness and discrimination, similar to the kind that Black people can attest to. The truth is that the reason many people think Black English is gutter talk is not all their fault. It's partly linguists' fault. We have not made the case to the public in a way that actually convinces, even when we think we have. And racism or not, there are ways of getting across the truth to even skeptical audiences. I've seen it, and I want to share what I've learned here. It's easy for a linguist to forget what language seems like to everyone else. But I feel a responsibility to try my hardest in order to, if I may, bring America out of Plato's cave. What I'm not going to do and why. First, let's take a look at what seems not to work, which will also be useful in gaining a sense of what linguists even mean when they say Black English is more than slang. Linguists and fellow travelers often teach people about Black English by discussing how the verb to be is used. In a sentence like, she be passing by, what almost anyone hears most immediately is that the be verb isn't conjugated, as opposed to standard English. She is passing by. However, there's more going on in a sentence like, she be passing by, than it might seem. This usage of be is very specific. It means that something happens on a regular basis rather than something going on right now. As counterintuitive as it seems, no Black person would say, she be passing by right now, because that isn't what be in that sentence is supposed to mean. Rather, it would be, she be passing by every Tuesday when I'm about to leave. In other words, that unconjugated be is, of all things, grammar. In standard English, it's easier to get a sense of what habitual refers to in language by thinking about how we express it in the past. She used to pass by every Tuesday means that it happened regularly. If you were referring to something that happened just once, you would use the simple past. She passed by just now. In Black English, you can make that same differentiation in the present. She's passing by right now. She be passing by every Tuesday. That's neat, in that you would never think of this from just listening to Black people talking, especially since we don't expect anything elegant or complex when people are just chatting. But linguists are trained to think that explaining this habitual be, as it's called in the biz, will teach people that Black English is okay. Specifically, we're taught to argue that the habitual be shows that Black English is systematic. If how the habitual be works is not just random but based on rules, as in something I had to carefully explain just now, then that means that Black English is as good as standard English, right? Wrong. Linguists have been telling people that Black English is systematic for almost 50 years now, and it's safe to say that the argument has made not a dent in public feelings about the dialect. There's a reason. As long as the be verb is still unconjugated, the habitual be still sounds wrong. People think to themselves, yeah, it's systematic, systematically wrong. It's the same with other things presented as examples of why there's nothing wrong with Black English. The layman can hear that in Black English the verb to be is often left out entirely. She my sister, they my friends.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?